your last name Claypool, that
Yep.
sounds like an English name, eh?
Well, I have to kind of start in Germany in 1300 to
Oh,
answer
really?
the question for you.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it was Claypool when it started in 1300 in Germany.
Uh-huh.
And so then they then moved to Holland. When they moved to Holland,
Yeah.
it got changed to Claypole, P-O-L-E.
Mm-hmm.
And they were there for 100 years, and by the way, 400 years later, or whatever, the Claypools in Pennsylvania still have that low German accent from living in Holland, and that's why you hear them referred to as Pennsylvania Dutchmen.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what happened then, they moved, after 100 years in Holland, they moved to England.
Mm-hmm.
And they were at Northborough, about 50, 100 miles north of London. And they were there till 1700. And during that period of time, in the little town they moved to, north of London, somehow the town was Claypole with an E on the end. And while we were there, we asked to have it researched. They could never find out whether the town was named after these Claypoles that moved in, or whether the Claypoles with an E took the name from the town. So we never did get that figured out. So anyway, they lived there, and while they were there, it anglicized the name to Claypool, P-O-O-L. And while we were there, that couple 100 years, one of the Claypool girls, married Oliver Cromwell's son.
Oh, wow.
And so then they put an E on the end to designate that they were related to Cromwell.
Good Protestants.
I would think, yeah. So then, later on, Cromwell didn't turn out like they expected, so they decided to, in 1700, take the E off the end of the name and disassociate him with Cromwell and hike her for Pennsylvania. And so they did. They went, two brothers, and moved to Pennsylvania, and later on, one moved to Kentucky and the other one moved to Minnesota. And our group moved to Minnesota, and not sure where the rest of the Claypools, but they're around someplace.
Mm.
So, of course, then from there, my mother's folks were born in Ireland, and they had moved to Wisconsin. In the early days when they were fighting, the fighting was going on, and they were United Empire Loyalists. You may have heard that.
Oh, yeah.
And so these United Empire Loyalists, when the Britain and France and the States were fighting, they wanted to stay with Canada because it looked like they were going to break away. And so my mother's folks moved to Ontario, Canada. And my mother's dad was born in Ontario, and then the family, when the fight was over, they moved back to Wisconsin, and my mother was born in Wisconsin.
Ah.
So that's kind of the background of the whole group. So of course, both my mother and dad moved to Canada because of this. Everybody was getting free land, and they were entrepreneurs, and so and they got married in Swift Current, and then raised their family at Beachy. So that's kind of the story, and they were old pioneers because, to give you an example, with these 12 children and very little income coming in, every fall, whatever grain that my dad had, he would take them to the grist mill, because they raised mainly wheat at that time, and oats for the horses.
Mm-hmm.
And he would take the wheat to the grist mill. The grist mill would take half the wheat for making the other half into flour.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad would come home with a horse and a wagon, and he'd usually have 30 sacks, 100-pound sacks of flour. And that would be in the fall. And that would last us until July the next year. And the mother and all the girls and everybody would be making all that into bread. And so 30 sacks of flour, we always stored it up in the attic. And that's how, of course, the families survived at that time.
Wow.
Yeah.
And over time, you say your brothers and sisters all moved away pretty much? Or?
Yeah, well, of course, by the time that I got old enough to leave, all my brothers and sisters had picking up or got married or picked up all the agriculture jobs, and there wasn't anything. So what I did then, I came to Alberta to actually work haying and thrashing on the ranches in southern Alberta, west of Nanton and High River at the Bar S and the Rocky P. And
these are ranches, were they? Or?
These are ranches west of Nanton and High River.
Oh, okay.
They're still, the Bar S and the Anchor Rocky P are still about third generation. They're still operating. The Bar S was the one that the Calgary Brewery owned, and I suspect that some of the third generation people still own it. But so then the fall of '49, we were thrashing, and it started to snow, and there was no work. And there was no radios in cars at that time, but I had a little radio on the dash of my car, little battered radio, and then in the evening, we could get a radio station in Edmonton. You remember now we're southwest of Calgary, and we heard about this discovery of oil, and we were sitting there.
This is
no
1949,
pay, and,
yeah.
And so we decided to take our summer's wages and buy an old car and hike north, and my cousin and I then went north to seek our fortune. And this old car we had was a 1940 two-door Chev, and with the old gravel and washboard road on number 2 highway, which is now 2A. If you got over 20 mile an hour, this washboard would shake the doors open, and you'd have to stop and tighten up all the latches. So we got to a little town called Calamar, west of Leduc. And my cousin was working on the rigs already by this time.
Look, I just want to interrupt you here for a second. I just want to start this as a new section.
Oh, yes, okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to go back
Yep.
and ask you again about your parents and, and the life on the farm.
Yeah.
Now, you had a radio, did you, at home?
Okay.
Yeah.
We had a radio, but it was battery operated.
Yeah.
And it cost 25 cents for one battery, and as I remember it, 90 cents for the other one. One was a dry cell and one was a wet cell. And only now and then would they afford the batteries, so we didn't have radio all the time, just whenever, that all of a sudden they could find $1 or $2 to buy the batteries. And so anyway, you could listen usually Foster Hewitt and the hockey games at night. When I came home from school, if I was allowed to turn it on and not run the batteries down so they could have hockey at Saturday night, I could listen to 15 minutes of The Lone Ranger.
Right.
And that was kind of my recreation.
Yeah.
And, certainly the recreation at night was hockey game if you had batteries for the radio.
What age would you be then? What age?
Well, I suppose that in that time we'd be 7 or 8 or so in that area.
Yeah.
My folks, by the way, when you talk about them, they were true pioneers because they it was prairie soil, and they broke the land and seeded things. But then when the 10 years of drought come along, most of the soil blew away, so there wasn't very much crop. Only every now and then you might get a a bit of a crop.
So they must have suffered really badly during that 10 years.
They did, and of course, all the time with no cash, and you've got to try and survive. So.
Yeah, yeah.
And they worked very hard because it was all done by hand.
Yeah.
Mother worked out in the garden and made these cheeses and helped milk the cows until the boys got old enough to do it.
Picked raspberries and strawberries probably.
And the other thing is they go to the river was about 30 miles away, and they would go and pick berries in the what we called the breaks going down to the river.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in wintertime, you made ice on the river,
Mm-hmm.
and so you could have an ice box in the summer,
Right.
where you put you didn't have any power, so
Mm-hmm.
you didn't have any refrigerators.
Did you have a root cellar?
We didn't have a root cellar. We had a nice ice house dug in the ground.
A hole down,
We didn't.
deep hole.
We had the old dirt basement or under the house,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where we kept everything cool. And like Mother put her cheeses down there to age,
Mm-hmm.
but that was the closest we had to a root cellar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, what would you use to heat your house?
Okay.
Because it's
first
pretty,
of all,
mostly prairie, eh?
It's interesting you bring this up.
Yeah.
The houses at that time were poorly insulated. They were insulated with straw or shavings. And so in the wintertime, and of course down in the prairies there, you have violent winters and a lot of snow and a lot of wind. Every fall, my dad would line the outside of the house with tar paper up to the windows, and then he would haul manure, and he'd pile manure around the house up to the windows, and to keep the house warm in the wintertime. And there was no trees, so the only trees that were there are the ones that the folks planted, just for a windbreak.
Yeah.
But we had to go and get coal. And they hopefully could find enough cash to buy coal, and that's how you heated the house with coal. You had a coal range, and Mother did all the cooking on that coal range and baking all the bread. And we had a living room, and we had a heater that everybody sat around there, and when you listened to the radio in the evening. So.
Mm-hmm. And you know, the water was always a problem, I guess, in that area.
Yeah, we had a well and a windlass where you dipped water, and of course that's how we kept the gardens going. You had a stone boat and a horse and a 45-gallon drum, and you dipped the water out of there and put it in the 45-gallon drum and took it out and watered the potatoes in the garden. That way you had vegetables in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
And of course with a lot of cattle and pigs, you had to have a lot of water for them.
Yeah.
And so we did have one well with a pump on it, and so the cattle could all come and drink. And somebody had to operate that pump because, of course, it was all by hand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the chickens, you didn't have chickens or ducks?
Yeah,
or
no, we
anything?
had chickens, had
Yeah.
our own eggs, and when I got to be about 5 or 6 years old, that was my job, was to look after the chickens and gather the eggs.
Yeah.
The other one I had was take out the ashes from the coal and wood stove, and in the summertime, empty the container underneath the ice box. Because as the ice melted and cooled your food, of course the water ran down, and if I forgot to empty that pan and it's running over my mother's kitchen, you can imagine that there's...
You would do your parents. Your parents are pretty strict, were they?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And so you had certain things to do, and you better do it.
Yeah.
So, of course, there was no facility inside, so with a big family, we had a two-holer outhouse out back because there was enough people going in and out of that outhouse. You needed,
Could have rush hour before school.
We had a larger hole and a smaller hole for
Okay.
kids and grown-ups.
Yeah.
But later on, the folks, when everybody moved away and the folks finally retired to the city, And they lived in the city for a long time, and finally
Which city? Which?
Saskatoon.
Oh, Saskatoon.
Finally ended up in the same seniors home.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad didn't wake up one morning at 97, and my mother didn't wake up one morning at 93. So
Not a bad run.
they were, yeah.
Pretty good run. Yeah.
And the interesting part was the day that my mother, they then took the body back to Beachy for the funeral, where we were born and raised. And there was such a heck of a blizzard on that to get out to the cemetery, which the cemetery was right by our old farm on the one corner. And so what we had to do was the roads were all blocked, and we had to get a rotary snowplow and just take the hearse and the pallbearers and the priest, and they plowed the road the 10 miles out to the cemetery, and we put the coffin in the ground, and then by this time the road was all blown in, and they had to rotary plow us all the way back to Beachy. And everybody said, well, isn't that a great way for an old pioneer, because that's the type of weather my folks put up with all the time they were raising this family.
Well, that's a good story.
Typical. Yeah.
Now, the Second World War, that must have affected your older siblings.
Yeah, I was too young for the Second World War.
Yeah.
And so we just helped on the farm and went to school. And yeah, and my dad, of course, was not called. And I had an older brother that was left on the farm, and the rest of the brothers were all called, but the ones that had infantile paralysis when they were young, every one of them only were in the army 2 days and got kicked out because they were all left with some one brother, the fingers were distorted. The other one, the legs were, and so anyway, the infantile paralysis had. They were all left with some.
Which is from polio and.
Polio today.
Yeah.
And one brother, his fingers were distorted, and another one, it was the muscle in the leg, and so they all. And another one had bad eyes, so they all got kicked out of the army, and they farmed then all through the Second World War.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So things worked out, because I'm sure your parents could have used them at that time too. Eh?
Yeah, they of course were too old to go in the army, and so they were still in the farm, and the boys were helping them.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you were just little.
Yeah, well, I was only 10 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. That one again. I carried on with all my chores that I found out how to do it on the farm.
Yeah, you got more chores. Were you, being the youngest, spoiled pretty badly? Were you, or?
I didn't think so.
No.
Obviously, you don't know what you're doing and what you should have been doing. So.
Yeah.